The year was 1848, and the state of Georgia was a suffocating prison for those born into bondage. The air in Macon was thick with the humidity of the South and the heavy scent of cotton and despair. In this world where human beings were bought and sold like livestock lived a woman named Ellen Craft. She was enslaved not by the darkness of her skin, but by the blood that ran through her veins. Ellen was the daughter of an African-American woman, and her white master a man named James Smith. Because of her heritage, Ellen appeared to be white. She had fair skin, long dark hair, and delicate features. But in the eyes of the law, and in the eyes of the South, she was property. She was a slave, and her life was not her own. Since she was a young girl, she had been torn away from her mother and forced to serve her half-sister, a mistress who treated her with cruelty and disdain. Ellen was a constant reminder of her master's infidelity, and so she was beaten and berated and locked away. She lived in constant fear that one day she would be sold south to the brutal rice plantations where life was short and suffering was endless. But Ellen possessed a fire that could not be extinguished. She was intelligent, observant, and fiercely determined. She also had a partner in this struggle, a man named William Craft. William was also enslaved, a skilled carpenter whose family had been torn apart by the slave trade. He and Ellen had fallen in love and married, but they had no right to their own happiness. Their marriage was not recognized by the state. They lived every day with the terrifying knowledge that William could be sold away or that Ellen could be taken to a distant state at a moment's notice. They decided that they would not wait for freedom to be given to them. They would take it. They would run. But running was not simple. The South was a fortress of patrols and slave catchers. Every road was watched. Every station was guarded. A black man and a black woman traveling alone would be stopped, questioned, and captured immediately. So Ellen and William devised a plan so audacious, so daring, and so dangerous that it seemed like madness. They would escape in plain sight. Ellen would disguise herself not as a slave, but as a white male slaveholder. Ellen Craft was a woman of striking intelligence. She knew that the society she lived in was built on rigid hierarchies. She knew that no white person would ever suspect a white gentleman of traveling with his enslaved servant to be a runaway. The plan relied entirely on the racism of the South. It required Ellen to step into the shoes of the oppressor to secure her freedom. She would pose as a wealthy young planter traveling to Philadelphia for medical treatment. William would pose as her faithful slave. It was a plan that required nerves of steel and absolute perfection. If Ellen slipped up, if her voice trembled, if she faltered in her disguise, they would be sent back, and they would likely be tortured or killed. The preparation was agonizing. Ellen cut her hair short and donned a suit of men's clothing complete with a high collar and a top hat. She had to learn to walk like a man to command the space around her with authority. But there were two challenges she could not easily hide. She could not read or write, and she did not have a beard. To solve the first problem, Ellen came up with a brilliant ruse. She placed her right arm in a sling and wrapped it in bandages, creating a fake injury. This served two purposes. It explained why she did not write or sign her name, and it created a sense of fragility that made people less likely to question her. To hide her lack of a beard, she created a poultice of green leaves and bandages which she wrapped around her jaw and chin, telling people she had a severe toothache and was under doctor's orders to keep her face wrapped. It was a disguise that transformed the hunted into the hunter. On December 21st, 1848, just days before Christmas, Ellen and William Craft stepped out of the shadow of slavery and into the light of the most dangerous gamble of their lives. The first leg of their journey was the most harrowing. They had to board a train in Macon. As they walked onto the platform, the tension was suffocating. Ellen walked with her head held high, feigning the arrogance of the planter class. She did not look at William. She did not speak to him. He walked behind her, carrying the bags, his eyes lowered in the subservience expected of a slave. They could hear the whispers of the passengers around them. They saw the looks of the white men lounging on the benches. Every stare felt like a spotlight. Every question was a potential death sentence. When the conductor came to collect tickets, Ellen's heart hammered against her ribs, so hard she thought it might bruise her chest. She handed over the ticket that William had purchased. The conductor looked at her, looked at the sling, looked at the bandages on her face. He asked for her name. She replied in a whisper that she was sick and had trouble speaking. He did not press further. He assumed she was a young gentleman suffering from a painful ailment. He moved on to William. William handed over his ticket signed by his master. The conductor looked at it. He looked at the white man standing next to him. He punched the ticket. They had passed the first test. But the journey was far from over. They had to travel by train, by steamboat, and by carriage through the heart of the slave-holding South. They had to cross into free territory. Every stop was a new nightmare. Every new passenger was a new threat. On the train to Savannah, Ellen was forced to sit in the crowded carriage, surrounded by white men who saw nothing but a fellow traveler. They began to talk about politics, about slavery, about the runaway slaves who were causing such an uproar in the South. They spoke of Ellen and William. They spoke of the advertisements that had been posted for their capture. They described the couple right in front of Ellen's eyes. They said the woman was light-skinned and might try to pass for white. Ellen sat there frozen, a bandage wrapped around her face, her arm, in a sling, listening to them describe her. She had to sit there and smile or nod or feign sleep. She had to show no reaction. It was a psychological torture, almost worse than the physical fear. William, standing in the slave car, heard the same conversations. He heard the plans to search the train. He heard the rewards being offered. But he stood firm. He played his role perfectly. When they stopped for meals, Ellen could not eat with William. She had to eat in the dining car with the white passengers while William ate scraps outside. They were so close yet forced to act as strangers. It was a profound sacrifice for their love and their freedom. They endured the stares, the questions, the prejudice. They endured the humiliation of playing the roles of master and slave, denying their dignity for the sake of their future. And they kept moving north. They arrived in Savannah and boarded a steamship bound for Charleston. Here the danger intensified. The ship's captain was a jovial man who took an interest in the sickly young planter. He invited Ellen to sit with him. He talked to her at length, asking about her home, her illness, her destination. Ellen had to rely on William's whispered cues and her own sharp wits. She pretended to be in too much pain to talk much, which only garnered more sympathy. The captain, a man who likely owned slaves himself, never suspected that the person sitting next to him was a woman who had escaped his world. He offered his protection. He offered her use of his cabin. She refused, terrified that he might see her undressed or discover her secret. She maintained her distance, maintaining the illusion of the fragile invalid. When they arrived in Charleston, the tension reached a breaking point. The laws in Charleston were strict. Any black person arriving by ship had to be imprisoned until their owner claimed them. William was technically that black person. But because he was with a white master, the authorities hesitated. They looked at William. They looked at the invalid Ellen. They did not want to offend a white gentleman by dragging his slave to jail. They let them pass. It was the arrogance of racism that opened the gate. The assumption that a white man must be obeyed and respected became the shield that protected them. They traveled from Charleston to Wilmington, North Carolina, and then on to Richmond, Virginia. They were getting closer to the border, the Mason-Dixon line, the line between slavery and freedom. But the closer they got, the more desperate the slaveholders became to catch them. In Richmond, the conductor was suspicious. He did not think the invalid story was convincing. He tried to force William to leave the car. He tried to separate him from his master. Ellen had to intervene. She had to use her voice. She had to speak with the authority of a white man, even though she was terrified. She told the conductor that William was her property, that he was a good boy, and that she would not be separated from him. She played the part of the indignant master perfectly. The conductor backed down. He apologized. It was a breathtaking moment of power and fear. Ellen had used the weapon of the oppressor against them. She had asserted her ownership over her husband to save them both. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but it worked. They boarded the final train to the Potomac River. They crossed into Washington, D.C., a city built by slaves but run by free men. They were so close they could taste it. But Washington was a dangerous place. It was a city where slave catchers operated freely. They had to board a steamship to travel up the Chesapeake Bay to Baltimore, and then finally take the train to Philadelphia. As they boarded the ship in Baltimore, Ellen saw a familiar face. It was a man who had once known her, a man who had seen her in Macon. He looked at her. He looked at the top hat, the bandage, the sling. He paused. Ellen stopped breathing. She looked him dead in the eye with a cold stare. She turned away. She acted as if he were a stranger bothering her. The man hesitated. He looked again, but the disguise was too good. The confidence was too convincing. He turned away. He let them pass. It was the final hurdle. They boarded the train in Baltimore. The wheels began to turn. The landscape began to change. The rolling hills of Maryland gave way to the industry of the North. Then the train stopped. The conductor announced Philadelphia. Ellen and William stepped onto the platform in Philadelphia. They were free. The air was cold, but it was the air of liberty. They looked at each other, perhaps for the first time in days, without the fear of being watched. They had done it. They had traveled 1,000 miles. They had crossed enemy lines. They had stared into the face of slavery and blinked first. Ellen Craft, the woman who could not read the woman who had been bought and sold, the woman who was considered property, had outsmarted the entire system. She had used her own whiteness as a shield and her own intelligence as a sword. William, the man who had crafted the plan, the man who had carried the bags and bowed his head, stood tall. They had escaped from slavery. Their story did not end in Philadelphia. They were famous now. Their daring escape captured the imagination of the North. They told their story. They spoke at abolitionist rallies. They wrote a book called Running 1,000 Miles for Freedom. They became icons of the anti-slavery movement. But they were not safe. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 meant that slave catchers could come north and drag them back. Ellen and William could never truly rest in the United States. So they made the heartbreaking decision to leave their home. They moved to England. In England, they were not fugitives. They were guests. They were educated. They raised a family. They continued to fight for the freedom of their people. But they never forgot Georgia. They never forgot the smell of the cotton fields or the sound of the trains. They returned to the United States after the Civil War, after the chains had been broken. They returned to Georgia not as slaves, but as free citizens. They started a school for freed slaves. Ellen and William Craft spent the rest of their lives building the future that they had once risked everything to reach. They proved that courage comes in all forms. They proved that the desire for freedom is the most powerful force in the human heart. Ellen Craft, the woman who dressed as a man to find her freedom, is a testament to the unbreakable spirit of resistance. She looked at the barriers of race and gender and class, and she walked right through them. She showed the world that no cage is unbreakable if you have the courage to pick the lock. If you love true stories of brave women, like and share the story and subscribe to the channel.